Good morning, friends. A happy Tuesday to you. Today, I want us to begin thinking about worship. Worship is something we typically do together when we think of worship as singing. But worship goes far beyond just singing hymns together, though that certainly is an element of it. What is worship? Well, the word itself means to bow or to revere. And this has to go far beyond just singing a song. If we are going to worship the Lord, we revere the Lord in all we do, and worship is a lifestyle rather than just something we set aside 10 or 20 minutes to do once a week. You see, worship is first to be to God alone. You might remember part of the Ten Commandments, for they say this, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." God is the one whom we worship, and God alone. Nothing else and nobody else. He is the one that deserves our worship. He is the one we revere. He is the one we submit our lives to. Worship is also something that will take place in heaven. It's not only here on the earth. In fact, worship is going on right now in heaven, and you can read about that in Revelation chapter 4. Also, when we think of worship, we must remember that God is the audience. When we sing songs together, and we miss doing that with you on Tuesday morning and look forward to the time we can start to do that again. But when we sing songs, it's not about me or Bob or Jackson or Linda or Sarah if she's there. It's about God. It's not a performance, it's worship. We are there to worship with you, not to put on a show for you. You see, God is the audience. We are the worshipers. He is the audience. And true worship causes a change in the lives of those who are worshiping. Believers have a vision of God as they're made aware of their sinful condition when they come face to face with him in worship. Isaiah chapter 6 verse 5 tells us of this, and Isaiah had a literal vision of God. And in that, he recognizes his own sinfulness when he comes face to face with God. And his response is that I need to be cleansed. And true worship brings us into that idea of communing with God and recognizing that he is Lord over all, and that we are the ones in need of his forgiveness. And thankfully, he has exhibited that to us through Jesus. And speaking of Jesus, he's had a conversation about worship as well. You might recall the story of the woman at the well, where Jesus encountered this woman alone at a well, and he had a conversation with her. And in that conversation, she said this. It's from John chapter 4, verse 20. The woman says to Jesus, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship." We go on and read that Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." That's what Jesus had to say about worship. That's how he described worship, that it must be in spirit and in truth. Sometimes worship is emotional. We sing a song and it takes us back to a time where it speaks deeply to us, and maybe tears flow, maybe joy overflows. Worship is an emotional experience, but we have to be careful that we don't substitute emotion for true worship. If we're not worshiping in spirit and in truth, if our time of worship does not challenge us to see God for who he is and to yield our lives to him and put him up above ourselves, then are we really worshiping? Or are we just having an emotional or a joyful experience? Also in that passage, we learn that worship is not something that takes place in only one spot. Rather, it's to be a constant in our lives. It's seen in our speech, our thoughts, our actions, our attitudes, as we revere God, as we look to him as master. We often think of worship as part of the church service, and that is something that the church does when they are together. And it's an important element of what the church does. And joining with believers to worship is a powerful moment. But we must not think that that's the only time we can worship. You can worship in your apartment. You can worship in small groups. We worship in the room together on Tuesday mornings. Worship takes place wherever we look unto God, wherever we revere and bow down to him. We want to live a life of worship, putting him first and above all else. You see, true worship is not something we set aside time to do. True worship, worship in spirit and truth, is something we live. Well, we're going to continue this thought of worship over the next few weeks. But today I leave you with that challenge to rethink what it means to worship. To look at it not just as a time where we sing together, but instead to recognize that true worship is to revere God in all we do and at all times. May you have a blessed Tuesday, and I look forward to sharing with you again.